We like to think here on Grit TV that we bring you some pretty special and interesting guests every day. But I have to say today is a little more special than usual. She's been called, well, a genius by the MacArthur Foundation, the Evel Knievel of dance, in other people's words. She calls herself an action architect. I call her my partner of the last 20 years. Elizabeth Streb is just out with a book, Streb, How to Become an Extreme Action Hero. Have you got anything to learn? Well, just maybe. Take a look. Here's Streb at work. Elizabeth Streb founded her company Ringside in 1983. In 2005, she founded SLAM, the Streb Lab for Action Mechanics. Her book is just out, Streb, How to Become an Extreme Action Hero, from our friends at the Feminist Press. I'm very happy to welcome you, Elizabeth, to the studio.
Thank you.
When we first met, and we're going back a while now, I looked at your work in the 80s. I didn't know what to think of it. I certainly didn't know how to think about it. When we see work like what we've just seen, some people use terms like crashes and slams and circus. And what do you want us to be looking at?
Well, it's hard definitionally to put a vocabulary onto action, certainly, and that gets expressed in my book time and time again. And I don't believe artists can control the perception of a lifetime audience. But separate from all of those qualifications, I really want the audience, the people who are witnessing the extreme action of Streb, to feel the moves, to forget, to kind of do a short circuit, right from the gut and the muscles past the brain into the heart. So I want people to go out of the theater thinking they've done some of those moves, or some of those moves at least have happened to them.
When we look at the falling, are we looking at the body? Are we looking at the falling? What?
Well, I keep sort of pushing this paradigm shift of perception in action terms. The reason we make it so extreme in my sort of mind, heart, and soul of the invention of action, I want it to be about the thing of movement. So if you're watching the body, you will never ever notice the action that the body is doing. And it's really requiring a paradigm shift that I don't think is quite happening yet.
You begin in the book by saying your adventure in life began with action. A lot of the stories you tell actually describe, beginning with sheetrock and eels and boxes of nails. Do you want to read one thing about the beginning of your relationship to flight?
Flight, sure. It's a pretty grubby story, my relationship with action, but this is a story of when I first noticed something pretty extraordinary. I first realized that I wanted to fly when I caught a fly in a mason jar. Wow, I wondered, how do they do that? I fell in a confused love with their erratic and immediate shifts of direction and their untraceable flight trajectories, impossible to memorize. I was jealous. So you see, the origins of my movement interests are pretty grubby. I never dreamt of being a ballerina. I hated the color pink and the fussy, flimsy look of the garments. I found the word tutu embarrassing even to say. It all started with a fly. Then came my attention to equipment and hardware and things that moved, knobs and gears, even if non-functional.
Started with a fly in a mason jar. Your father was a mason. Did he influence you?
Yes. My father did influence me quite a lot, much to my dismay, because in fact, he was my adopted father. I didn't really like him. But he was extremely hardcore. He taught me, as if I were a guy, how to fish, how to hunt, how to hold ceilings up. That's one of the stories in the book.
What do you mean, how to hold ceilings up?
Well, I would help him on the job a lot.
You're talking you?
Me,
at
this
age
kid.
6, 7?
Well, probably 8 or 9, 10. I'd be on the job with him, hang out with him. And what I learned from him was extreme labor. You know, a guy who knew no end to how hard he had to work to get the day finished with. For instance, he'd asked me once, he ran out of nails and said, would you hold this ceiling up? And I said, okay. And he said, I'll be back soon. But he wasn't back soon. But I held the ceiling up, and I felt, if he never comes back, I will be here till the end of the earth, because I would never fail in an act in front of him or even just with myself in life.
You describe in the book holding up those pieces of sheetrock and feeling like you couldn't hold them up any longer and then managing somehow. And where most of us would have run screaming, you found the whole experience interesting. You then chose the field of dance years later, kind of in pursuit of that interesting feeling. But you had a hard time finding it. You say that ballet smelled elitist, even the training. What do you mean?
Well, I think that in my sort of grasp of action at that time, it wasn't about being in total control. It was clear that ballet was about demonstrating a physical perfection. That took, granted, 20 years to acquire. So I didn't diss it at all. I did not believe that was movement. And my interest was movement, in a way, not dance.
Explain the difference. And when you say that the gender politics in ballet was past tense, what so annoyed you?
Well, I think that, first, the class idea that you just mentioned, the notion that you can train every day, that your mom or dad, they're going to take you to dance class and you're going to do that for 10 years before you go to college. That is only for privileged people for the most part, mostly privileged people. So therefore, and I think that when you have a straight spine and you're exercising movement and you're not really even bending down the way workers do, you're dancing to the queen. That's what ballet was based on in the French courts. In the sense that it's not movement, for me, ballet, when you're in control, you're not really moving. You can't be. You have to be able to harness the forces of action, then let it rip. And I always say that unless you have both feet off the ground, you're not really moving because you don't have to. There's no emergency occurring.
Who are your favorite real movers?
The people I grew up with admiring are the guys and a few women that went over Niagara in a Barrel, Evel Knievel, the slapstick artists, all the unnamed circus performers, Merce Cunningham and Trisha Brown, who I really didn't get to know till I was in my late teens, early 20s, because my family didn't know who they were. They're downtown experimental dance artists.
Well, explain that then. So a lot of people are familiar with Evel Knievel. They understand he, on a motorcycle he wanted to go over Grand Canyon, went over tens of trucks at a time. Right. What's the connection between that and Trisha Brown or Merce Cunningham, a very different kind of modern dance move?
Well, I think that the connection would have to be a stretch. Evel Knievel had a dream of flight as well. And his dream of flight usually ended in a crash, which I have deep respect for. For me, crashing is a failure of flight. And Streb particularly takes the hit. We do impact, we land. Most dance forms do not do that. The connection between someone like Evel Knievel and Merce and Trisha is similar in that their dream was to create, in my opinion, a new language of movement, to enhance the richness of the vocabulary that existed to date in modern dance. And to do that, they analyze space and time and methodologies.
Why are you wanting to bring this real move to the world?
I think I believe that in the best of all possible worlds, one, if you talk about the number of people starving in the world, it's a hard argument. We haven't developed the metrics for why culture is critical. But for me, if you're really going to try and compare, bread and beauty, you're going to get into a very snarly argument. For me, anyone who does a move that's real or sees it or witnesses it, their life changes in that half second. I don't think they have to be exposed to it. I don't think it's about education. I think it's about just witnessing something extraordinary. And my belief in the power of culture, specifically in the United States, because that's my terrain, is never ending. I think it could wipe out sadness and Ritalin and every other bad thing that exists. And if I didn't believe that, it would be hard to dedicate myself to it.
Let's take a look at a piece that you did early on. It came to be a signature piece of yours called Little Ease. Do you want to introduce it at all?
Well, a lot of my pieces, they look quite crazy. The formal idea here was that I measured my body exactly. I built a box that was 2 feet deep, 6 feet across, and 3 feet high. And I was already taking up all the space that was available, and I tried to see, in terms of infinity, how much extra things I could do within that limited space.
His little ease. Space. It's the title of one of the chapters in your book. Your book's divided into space, motion, time, body. What's the most interesting question about space for you right now?
Right now, I think the notion of what the heck is it plagues me continually. And I believe that our venture at Streb is to try and figure out, if you can imagine, where we haven't yet been. And it's an impossible, sort of paradoxical question, because you don't know where you haven't been, because you haven't been there. And we try to go to unhabitual places in space, sensing that getting ourselves there will produce a unique and new set of moves. And the big challenge is a thought experiment, really. What piece of hardware, we use a lot of hardware, as you can see, will help us achieve access to those unknown, as yet unknown spaces. And so I sit every night and think, where haven't I been, and how can I get there?
So that's what you're doing. No. SLAM, your action lab, the Streb Lab for Action Mechanics. You call it the Un-Lincoln Center.
Well, in short, my question about 8 years ago was, what's my civic responsibility in terms of my set of contributions and what they might be. And I decided it was to try and conjugate a place where people gather, to ask people, given what I've made, the general public, what is it they care about within that genre of action. And I realized mostly they wanted bathrooms and drinking fountains and some place to congregate. And my question was, how will the youth congregate? How will they choose to assemble physically in real time in the 21st century? And I built SLAM. And I built it as an action.
You walked into a warehouse filled to the ceiling with boxes of, I think it was Chinese food.
It was, yeah.
And you had this vision. And now it is packed. Well, who goes there?
Well, every person is invited there, but who goes there? About 300 to 400 kids a week. The Streb, 8-member extreme action company, flying trapeze artists, circus artists, pre-circ, post-circ, and people from all over the world who've heard about it, mostly virally and word of mouth, come in because they know our rehearsals are open to the public.
But can you really concentrate, and can your dancers really concentrate? I mean, this is pretty far from the beautiful, serene floor and quiet space and mirrors with a bar. It
certainly is. And the big gap, the seismic gap we had to cross, and I lost my entire company at the time I moved into SLAM in 2003, is to invite interruption and the idea of strangers, that artists can be interrupted. If it's a great idea, I promise you, it'll occur to you again, even within the interruptiveness that occurs with strangers walking in. I've learned a lot by inviting these ideas of interruption and strangers. And I think that the dancers use it as an incentive to perform, even though we're just rehearsing. So the dancers that are currently in the company completely adopt the principles of Streb and the new idea, the new rules of conduct that audiences can partake in by coming into that action invention garage.
You have some lists of rules of behavior that are pretty different. Maybe we'll be able to post that at our website.
Okay.
Is there a body type for a Streb actioneer?
Well, the bigger the better. That's the only body type I care about. Those that have constitutionally an impervious body to any kind of chronic injury. You cannot be fragile. And the bigger you are, within your ability to still contain that size and move with freedom, the happier I am.
Why so?
Because they affect space more. You know, a very skinny, kind of Balanchine-esque ballerina body cannot do a thing to space. It's just a pathetic attempt to move and cause the action or the forces you create by your movement to have any ability to reach the audience. It's just a visual thing when you're too skinny or just skinny. So I like people who are hunky to move around my space on my stage.
And that's speaking as somebody who was skinny growing up, according to your book, at different times anyway. Yeah, Elizabeth, you talk about fear and worry, and this relates to your last comments too. And you suggest that for women in particular, young women, it's critical not to fear the future, worry about themselves. What do you mean by that?
Well, if you've decided to become an action specialist, I mean two things by that. I mean, this is a present tense technique, so you go for broke at every instant, and that means not, well, if I do this, this will happen. That's the future. You just take your whole entity and throw yourself into the circumstance or the condition of the particular physical activity. The other thing I mean is I think women in certainly our culture are just way too coddled for the most part. And I think in the book, talk about landing in San Francisco with $80 and really couldn't call my dad for money, and I dealt with it, and I think I did the same when I came to New York, had $200. But I think there's something extremely powerful about a female to know that they can, with the day that they're given, imagine and figure out how they can get through that day, then the next, and the next, without relying on the trade-off that often happens by making, I say pacts with the devil, or people who really, are a little nervous about you following your dream.
But maybe we're just scared. There's a lot of violence directed towards women. Women are disproportionately victimized.
Well, and that's certainly true. I think women are more vulnerable out in the world, but I think that it's possible to contend with that potential violence with a set of inventions that allow you to escape harm. And I think that doesn't happen if you never face those circumstances. So it's sort of, yes, that's true, but this other thing is also true, and then you become a full human in the world.
What are your questions today? What are you experimenting with next?
Well, I'd like to be able to, I've become very interested in the generation of force and being able to visualize that force and have it apparent to an audience. I'm interested also in skipping a spot in space. I'm also interested in occupying the same space at the same time. I'm interested in how fast can the human go before they disappear. And so therefore, I'm pretty interested in getting a bunch of pretty heavy ejection devices and high-powered motors into our equipment so that the bodies that we deal with can contend with forces that they won't at first recognize but soon will master.
Are there any limits?
Well, in terms of the normal idea of limits, we've approached action with the human body on the planet Earth as if there were no limits, that the impossible is possible. There's nothing that the body can't do. The real limitation is what the mind can imagine. We do, however, encounter, when we get into some of these new spatial terrains, what ordinary people might call pain. But very, very long ago, I amended that definition to mean pain to us is another rather interesting foreign sensation, not pain. And it's surprising and miraculous how much closer you can come to sort of a demon feeling or like a horrible initial ragged physical experience and accept it as something that is a road to another spot in space or another physical move.
Is that what you thought when you set yourself on fire or when you dove through glass?
Right. Well, those were surprising moments. But what's really surprising about that is you can't imagine it beforehand. You think intellectually, I know what it's going to be like to dive through glass, and one might say, don't do that. This and that can happen. But what really happens physically is nothing that you would have pre-imagined. And each of those times when I set myself on fire, I tried to put a fire out and I became on fire. And when I dove through glass. I was completely mesmerized by the fact that it was nothing like what I had initially imagined it to be.
You write about diving through glass at the Joyce Theatre at the end of your book. Would you read that part for us?
Yeah, sure. This happened at the Joyce Theatre. I got to the Joyce with hardly enough time to get dressed and onto the stage. I stood upstage center, staring at the frame with my heart pounding out of my chest. I have never not been terrified before a performance, but this was much worse than usual. The lights went out, except for on the glass on stage. I crouched down and time went by, a little too much time. I was waiting to be ready. Then I knew I wasn't going to be ready. So I shot down stage with every corpuscle of metal, blood, gristle, muscle, bones, sinews pushing, thrashing out of me. I let out a blood-curdling scream as I launched my body and my mind at that glass, punching so hard the glass flew into the first 3 rows of the audience. I landed, at least 2 feet downstage of the frame. It was stock still, with a big hole in it. Glass was everywhere. It only lasted 2 seconds.
A real move from Elizabeth Streb. The book is How to Become an Extreme Action Hero. There's a link at our website. And if you're curious about the company, you can check out their spring season. It starts April 16th in New York. Again, there's a link at our site. That's grittv.org. Elizabeth Streb, thanks for coming into Grit TV.
You're welcome. Thank you.